Good afternoon, Art History One. I hope you're doing very well as we move into the Gothic Cathedral and the Gothic ages. I hope things are very well. One of my favorite, one of the most beautiful art forms on the entire planet, as you can see on either side of me, are stained glass windows. And in honor, of course, my outfits often tie in with what we are doing on the class today. So today I actually have my stained glass Star Wars from the very first, A New Hope, actually the fourth film on in honor of our stained glass study today in Gothic cathedrals. Here you'll see the number one most important, most famous Gothic cathedrals of all time right behind me called the Sainte-Chapelle, which you read about, but we'll also be talking about here in class in a little while. So as we go through here, let me share my screen with you, and we will come back and look at that beautiful Sainte-Chapelle in my background. All right. The Gothic experience that we're looking at really is the Gothic experience of heaven. And it runs from about 1140 to 1400 CE. And so it's a good part of a period that will lead us up until the Renaissance. You'll note the stained glass as well as the churches are going to get way more beautiful, larger. They're going to reach towards the heavens. We're going to have these gorgeous Gothic spires and flying buttresses that start to develop off of them. Now, just like we saw with the Romanesque planned churches, in these we are going to have Christ here on everyday earth, and to run through those very simple kind of features that we talked about. The very bottom, the washing of the feet when you first walk into a church, we are going to have the lovely narthex. The next part in is the nave, the naive, where all of us would go and pray and hear the sermon. On the outside, so you could actually go and see the relics without disturbing anything, are aisles, and that's where we get the kind of movie theater aisles. We have the transept, which is the crucifixion period of Jesus here. Then we have the choir, where the preacher or where the choir is going to sing those lovely images from the Bible. Walking around at the very top up here, the ambulatory, but the entire shape is the shape of Christ's head that happens to be here, and that is the apse. That's where those relics are going to be. And where wealthy people can actually afford to have their own private areas of worship within the church, whereas we get the nave, they get these beautiful chapels. And if they come off the head, they're called radiating chapels. So on some level, when you walk into the body of a Romanesque or a Gothic church, you're basically walking into Christ here on heaven, here on earth. Now, how do we know about the Gothic cathedrals? Well, the Gothic cathedrals are really easy to find. They are so dominant as a center of every town, whether we're looking in the medieval world or later on, is that you'll note you can actually see their giant feature here in the town of Carcassonne. Note it's right here. You can actually see the dominant area that it plays and how it dominates the space. Many times there'll be more than one Gothic cathedral in a town, and there might even be competing interests between a Cluniac and a Cistercian. But the vast, vast, vast majority of Gothic cathedrals are going to be those that are actually for the Cluniac, more beautiful orders. Now, during the Gothic, we're going to have a change from the Romanesque. During the Gothic, military protection moved from thickly buttressed church walls to standing armies. And so churches can actually become even more decorated like heaven. And so we are not going to have these very thick walls like we have over here on the left. We're going to end up with much more gorgeous, kind of decorated, Gothic type spires and crenellations, these pointy, sticky aspects that are going to show up flying off of a Gothic cathedral. So if we look at and compare the difference between the Romanesque on the right and the Gothic new style of architecture, architectural features borrowed from ancient Rome include in the Romanesque the solid masonry walls, the rounded arches that's removed from a community, the place of worship, dark, they're monumental, they're massive, and the height is not nearly as tall. In the Gothic, we're going to have less solid walls, way more windows. We're going to have a four-part growing vault and a pointed arch. We'll talk about why that is very important. We're going to have cathedrals are going to be the center of life. They're going to be in the middle of town, often next to universities and next to where the guilds are. These Gothic cathedrals are going to represent heaven on earth, and this beautiful illuminated light like you see behind me on either side is going to come in for stained glass. The artwork and the architecture is going to appear almost like it's floating. It's so light compared to everything we've seen. We're going to have very much this vertical emphasis, and so it's going to be much higher, growing towards the heaven, growing towards God. Now, the rise of the Gothic medieval town has to do with a bunch of different features that show up here. One of the most important, which we'll watch a video of in a moment, is the guild development. And so here in the above and below, above is the guild development for the bakers and the goldsmith guild beneath. Everyone who wants to actually participate in any type of activity, business activity within a town, is going to have to be a member of the guild. We're going to have the rise of the powerful kings, and eventually they are going to amass enough knights and territory, and we're going to start to get nation states that are going to develop. We're going to have England itself develop. We're going to have France develop. We're going to have different portions of the Italian peninsula develop in terms of different empires. Cathedrals are going to be central to the city life, and the rise of universities as the religious centers. Now, if you went to university, there's one book that everyone studies, and that is the Bible. It matters not whether you're doing law. It matters not if you are doing biology or medicine or goldsmithing. When you go to a university, one of your major texts is going to be the Bible in every course you take. So here's a video that actually talks about the importance of the guilds during this time period.
Greetings, students, and welcome to another edition of Mr. Zoller's Social Studies podcast. Now, today we are going to be talking about medieval guilds. We know that early on in the medieval times that everything was based around those feudal manors, right, and manorialism. Well, what we're going to see happen, though, as we move forward,
let me introduce you to my daughter.
Crusades, we know that things
Say
are
hi.
going to change. We're moving away from manorialism. Manorialism is that idea of self-sufficient manners, right? Well, now we're moving into a period of trade. We see that trade rekindled, and so what we start to see happening are goods flowing into Europe now for the first time.
All of those roads were left by the Romans.
To Europe from the Middle East after the Crusades. They're heading up from the Vikings. They're moving into trade areas like Flanders, the Hanseatic League. And so for the first time in a long time, we actually see trade goods that are available throughout Europe. Well, as these trade goods start to come in, as these goods start to be available, as people start to flock to towns as a result of this influence of trades, what we start to see develop are these guilds, these associations and groups of artisans and craftsmen who are going to group themselves together, join together for their economic benefit. So this might be a group of weavers, a group of blacksmiths, a group of shoemakers, something like that. What they're going to try to do is control all of the trade in a given town. So like, for example, all of the bakers in a certain town might all be members of the Bakers Guild. And the idea
is very similar to the rise of unions today.
To set certain rules like for things like wages, hours, and working conditions. They can be in control of that. The other thing that allows them to do is to make sure that nobody else is going to be able to come in and do that job unless they speak with the guild, unless they pay them some sort of fee in order to come in and participate in the economic system in that particular area. The other thing, though, that guilds do is they're going to offer a support group for these merchants. Now that people have moved outside of the manors, that they're not just relying on the feudal lords, they're going to have to rely on each other for things like assistance. It might be something like loans. An example might be that if a guild member dies, the guild would step in and they would take care of the widow or take care of the children in that particular instance. The other thing that guilds are going to do, though, is they're going to take control of training future guild members. And so what's going to happen is, this is going to start at the very beginning, at a very young age, when a parent would bring their child into a member of that guild.
And artists would be trained in as well. This is the same process Leonardo da Vinci and Michelangelo will go through in the Renaissance.
Or a blacksmith, something like that. And so they bring their child in, and initially what happens is they actually are going to pay this guild member in order to house and feed this child. And you notice that it actually on the sheet, by the way, sorry ladies, it says boy, and that's really what we're talking about in this situation here. That boy is going to come in, he's going to live in the master's house. He's going to be considered an apprentice, but that apprentice is really working for the master, and the parents are paying for that child to be in there. And that's going to last for a period of about 9 years. But over time, the child is going to be learning the trade. They're going to be learning what needs to happen little by little over the course of their upbringing. And then eventually what happens is they're going to be promoted to the job of journeyman. Once they become a journeyman, then they actually are going to receive wages. They're going to be paid for the work that they're doing because now they are sufficiently good at this trade that they are actually adding to the production that this particular member of the guild is able to come up with. But while this person is working and while they're receiving wages, they're also working on their masterpiece. And the idea is, once they have created a masterpiece, they have demonstrated now that they are worthy of being a member of the guild in their own right. And so what will happen is then they would be allowed to go out and open up their own shop and run their own craft as well during the town and become a member of the guild. And then this cycle will just repeat again in the future. That's how these guilds were structured, and they're going to become an important part of the economic system during medieval times. That's all for our podcast for today. I hope you have enjoyed it and continue to study the social studies.
And one of the things that's important is that guild membership, besides them telling you that you've created a masterwork, is very important because it's also very expensive. So imagine that it might be a $15,000 buy-in fee to be a member of the guild, which basically means that they are ensuring both the quality, but that other people are interested in buying your work as well, so it doesn't minimize other people's work within that same guild. So they are very much looking at not just training, but also the quality of the craftsmanship of what's coming out at any given time period. So if we go and we look at the cathedrals then that are built by different guild members, there are people who do sculpture, there are people who do the architecture, there are people who actually do stained glass. You'll note in each of these cases, from Florence to Siena to Canterbury, even in New York today, Amiens and Rome, there is a large dominance. And when you look at the aerial view of the city, you absolutely can see how the Gothic Cathedral very much dominates that area. In the back, we have Gregorian chants. So what does the word Gothic mean? Gothic comes from the word Goths, which actually the Romans used, and they mean barbarians. And so Gothic actually means barbarians, which is ironic because they treat everyone else as pagans and barbarians because they are the Christians that are running the town. You can note within the Gothic Cathedral, we are still going to have the lovely cross shape that actually shows up in the floor plan and in the church here, with the cross with the transept right here forming the cross. At the very front, there's going to be a rose window, and there's going to be a rose window gently off of each portal. Those are generally almost always dedicated to the Virgin Mary. Now, where Gothic really gets its kickoff is going to be with Saint Denis with Abbot Suger in Paris. What is interesting about Abbot Suger, and this is him depicted on the right, he was beheaded, and supposedly after the beheading of his body for being martyrdom, his body picked up his head and walked to the location where Saint Denis would be founded. This is actually in northern Paris, and started what actually is the Saint Denis monastery, and later on will become the cathedral. Now, what Saint Denis does and what Abbot Suger does is he basically takes all the best Christian ideas from the Romanesque, and he's going to combine them in one church. So he's going to take the pointed arch, he's going to take the flying buttress, he's going to take the two-tower facade, the vertical emphasis, and the impact of divine light. All of these have Christian references, which we'll talk about, that make them a better use in terms of coming up with a combined idea of how architecture, philosophy, religion, and this spiritual journey of the individual that's actually practicing and trying to get closer to God come together. So it's going to be a combination of all these different events. Now, note, none of these are developed during the Gothic. They just happen to be combined by the first person who basically invents Gothic, and that's Abbot Suger. So let's start off with the Gothic features. First off, the round arch. We saw the round arch in Romanesque, and it's a Roman arch. The problem with the round arch, it's not that stable. So if you actually put your hand up and let it on the table and push down on a round shape, you'll be able to push that hand down pretty easily. If you try to make a pointed arch, this arch that looks much more like this, a pointed arch, you try to do the same thing and point that. It's almost impossible unless you break your fingers to break that. Why? The pointed arch actually distributes weight way better than does the rounded arch. The rounded arch tends to have a possibility of expanding, so it doesn't expand. That's why we put giant buttresses and thick masonry walls behind it. It looks like a castle, or it looks like, like we're trying to protect people. We can't put a lot of holes in the wall for windows. Once we actually change that, you no longer need those thick masonry walls when you have a pointed arch. So the pointed arch is much better in terms of support. It also means we can make our church way taller, and it also means we have way more holes within our church that we can add beautiful stained glass to change the experience with light, divine light of God coming in. Now, why or how on earth are they going to get away with using the Muslim arch, which was invented in the Middle East and transported over? Well, luckily during this time period, there's no Facebook, there's no cameras, there's no Twitter, there's no Instagram. And so what are they going to do when they bring it back? They're going to call it the Christian arch, or they're just going to call it the pointed arch, not the Muslim arch, and no one's going to know the difference. Remember, very few people ever travel farther than 10 miles away from their home. And so they're pretty isolated in their communities. The next thing is the flying buttress. Before this, in order to support the very thick walls, we used to have giant buttress, massive stone, sometimes 20 feet thick, blocking it. With a flying buttress, what we're going to do is we're going to take that same amount of weight, but rather than having it right up next where we can't put walls and can't put windows, we're going to separate it out. And so we're going to have these right here, the flying buttress, still the same amount of weight and support, but note the gap now where you see my neck, or now where you see my face, we can now put in a stained glass in that space, and we can show you the story of Jesus, and divine light can pour into our church. Our church has become much more light because of the flying buttress. And that's going to get us to the bottom one as well. Here we see the flying buttresses. It's the same amount of weight and support. It just happens to be pushing farther off. Our third thing, we're going to move to a two-tower facade. Our two-tower facade then basically gives us 3 openings. This began in the Romanesque, as we saw, but it really is dominant within the Gothic. That they're generally those towers are slightly, depending upon where we are. If we're in Italy, they're about the same size. In southern France, they're about the same size. And in Germany and England and other places, they'll have 2 different towers that are competing against one another, but there's always 3 openings. Generally not 5, not 7. Why 3? The Trinity. Everything is going to show up with Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit from Christian faith. And we're going to see that over and over. No matter whether it's in Paris, in Italy, in France, or in Austria, those 3 main entrances to get into the church. The other thing is we are going to go vertical. Now with this idea of flying buttresses and being able to channel the weight farther down and not needing those thick buttress walls, we can make our church higher and higher and higher. And the goal is for each church, as it's being made over its 20 to 30 year period, to get higher than the church that was finished before. The highest church gets just to about 200 feet, and that's about the highest that we can make any of the nave walls. You can see here we have a 4-part groin vault rather than the barrel vault, which is just a circular space. Here we have basically 2 arches at a 90-degree angle, which also makes it more supportive and able to get higher and higher and higher. And as you were listening and hearing the back, the most important part of the Gothic Cathedral, once we develop those flying buttresses, is the impact of divine light. We are now going to tell giant Christian stories, not on historiated capitals, which people can't see. They're dark at night. We're actually going to tell them through one of the most beautiful art forms ever created, this beautiful filtered light that shows up within the stained glass and that you see reflecting throughout this presentation behind me. So the outside light, when it comes in, is just white light. It's transformed into purity through stained glass, the same way a sinner's soul is transformed to purity when they walk into the church. Because what do you do when you walk into a church? You wash your hands. Remember, that's what you do in the narthex when you walk in. Before you enter the full-fledged aspect of where you're going to pray in the nave, you wash your hands. And so stained glass does the same thing. It purifies the light that happens to be outside of the church, and when it comes in, then is pure light. So as we look and kind of progress forward, you will note the number of stained glass and how good we get. In early Gothic in Saint Denis, yes, we have beautiful stained glass, and it was a revolutionary new way of making architecture that everyone kind of borrows or plagiarizes, called early Gothic or French Gothic. We are slowly going to kind of continue to make the buttressing much, much better, much, much thinner. We're going to develop some new technical innovations in terms of how we kind of support the glass itself. And so eventually we're going to get to High Gothic. At the very end, it's basically Gothic gone wild. That's Rayenon, Sainte-Chapelle, generally the building that's considered to have the most beautiful stained glass, because the entire building, if you look at it, how is the roof being held up? I mean, it really looks like it's floating on glass, which is very fragile. So that is the French king's private chapel to go and pray at, called the Sainte-Chapelle. We'll come back and look at that later on, the Rayenon. So the birth of the High Gothic is really Notre Dame Cathedral. And unfortunately, many of you know this is the cathedral that caught on fire last year and destroyed a number of the relics. But because it was made of stone, it will be able to be repaired. It's right in the middle of the heart of France on Ile-de-Cité, that area of Paris that was originally, Paris was founded by the Romans, and Ile-de-Cité was actually the central hub, still the central hub of Paris today. Saint-Chapelle is basically right across the road. And one of my son's favorite activities then was to actually play soccer. There's often soccer games going out the side because it's generally a large open area outside of a church, particularly during the evenings. So those Gothic features that we are going to see and be looking for that are different from Romanesque, we're going to be looking for the pointed arch. We're going to be looking for the flying buttress. We're going to be looking for two tower facades. We're going to be looking at vertical emphasis and the impact of divine light. All of those together give us a semblance of what a Gothic cathedral is. Now, in a Romanesque church, you might find one or two of these different events. Remember, because Abbot Suger takes the best ideas from the Christian background and puts them all together in one church. So they were all invented in other areas of Romanesque, but combined by Abbot Suger in Saint-Denis. That's why Saint-Denis is such a landmark architectural monument. The High Gothic and the perfection of the High Gothic really is going to be in Chartres Cathedral, or Chartres, which is an hour and a half southwest of Paris. If you ever go to Paris, you can take a train to reach Chartres in about an hour. It's about a half hour away from Versailles. So you can actually see both in a day trip. Chartres at night, they're just gorgeous. And you can see, unfortunately, this is Notre Dame Cathedral when it caught on fire last year. Luckily, a lot of the most important areas were actually saved. It was already under construction, so they were repairing it. But the stonework will generally support itself. The roof will need to be replaced. Now, actually, I'm going to stop sharing this only so we don't listen to Gothic Cathedral the entire time and then go back. Just because not everyone can concentrate on the Gothic at the exact same time. There we go. There we go. So we have a change then in the area outside of a door. And so this name actually is called the tympanum. It's from Autun. That's the Romanesque one we looked at, and that is the Last Judgment. In the Gothic, we're actually going to stop trying people and having some of our punishments right outside of the church. And so we're actually going to get a much more positive spin. And so in the Gothic tympanum, which is this circular area out here, in that Gothic tympanum, and I'm going to move this out of the way a little bit, Jesus is celebrating all people arising to heaven with love and mercy. No, that's a change. We've been largely up to this point be talking about fearing God. Yes, some people will love God and God's majesty, what God offers, but it's mostly fearing God that has really driven us, really since the Christian world to the very present, unless you're a monk or a monastic individual who knows they've lived a devout life. The general population fears God. We're going to see some of that in Gothic art as well. But in the tympanum, Jesus celebrates all people. And all these individuals then, the elders, they're all going to heaven. So, and he's surrounded then by the four patron saints here of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, which we saw in the book of Kells a couple weeks ago. Now, when we go in the inside, note what's pretty remarkable about a Gothic cathedral is the inside and the outside match up. So here we have one of those chances where we look at another United Nations Sustainable Development Goal that gender equality just isn't here yet. And we'll see why. As regards, and this is from St. Thomas Aquinas, from Summa Theologica. As regards to individual nature, woman is defective and misbegotten. For the active power in the male seed tends to the production of a perfect likeness according to the masculine sex. Note, basically, this is taking off of what Aristotle said from the Greek period a long time ago. While the production of women comes from a defect in active power. So men are active and women are reactive or not active at all. And so one of the things that shows up is that when you go into a Christian church, you want to be overwhelmed by the Christian holy experience. And when you walk in, there's men and women. Well, when men are walking in and women are in their Sunday day best, men are going to be attracted to the women. Rather than concentrating on God, women might be a distraction. Their beauty, they've actually bathed so they no longer stink. They've cleaned themselves. They look at their absolute, what we call their Sunday best every time they go there. And that can be distracting, particularly to young men or to monks who are there just to pray to God, to make sure that we can actually pray and understand God and his message and the fear as well as the love of God. We need to separate the sexes out. So you'll note women go up to the second floor in this very dark cavern, and men get to worship down here. Women, of course, you're going to take the children as well, because men need to concentrate on God. This is your area of prayer. Note, there is no railing and you have to stand. There's no seating that shows up in here. So this is the female area that shows up, called the triforium. And so this is where women are going to pray, which they're watching their children. And remember, Roman Catholic masses can take 2 or 3 hours up in that little tiny space that shows up there. Yes, the question shows up. Women do pass out and they do faint, and many a woman has actually fallen to her death during the actual service, or a child. And even today, many of these triforiums are roped off. They say it's not safe enough for people to even walk up there today, yet they used to let women stay in that 5-foot little area. Remember, that's all the way to the town that would have to stay there. One of the things that shows up is, don't think this is so unusual. Women don't move gently down from the triforium in most parts of Europe until the 18th century. And so religions have long separated the sexes, as men are easily distracted by female beauty. But rather putting men up on the top because we're the ones distracted, women are the ones actually doing the distraction. So we get the prime seats, the prime area to be able to hear. Muslim mosques still do this today in many capacity, and not all, but many have a male side and a female side. So it's not height level, but it's a way where you're looking forward at the imam who's actually given the service, so that you concentrate really on Allah and your relationship with God. And there's the label of the triforium. Note, there's a tripartite division, just like we saw on the outside. And basically the number of bays, which is in this one, this is 1 bay here, 2 bays here, 3 bays here. But note also 1 arch, 2 arch, 3 arch. We're going to emphasize over and over the Trinity. And everything we're going to do is going to be God, the Father, and the Holy Spirit. We're going to try to see that over and over in that unification within the Gothic world. And we can thank Abbot Suger for that. Here's the layout. Now, one of the things that happens is that most people have no idea there's a very limited pool of workers who know how to make this particular style. It takes somewhere between 30 to 40 years, sometimes even longer. It takes decades to make this particular style of architecture. It's brand new, it's innovative, it goes up slowly, and also you have to take 5 or 6 months off every year because these are being made in Europe where there are deep snows, particularly when we get very far north, we get into France and Germany, Austria, up into the mountains. And so here's how a Gothic cathedral actually stands from an architectural perspective. Remember, very few people know how to do this, and these people get paid well. They're all members of the Builders Guild.
Gothic cathedrals represent one of the high points in Western architecture.
And note all the beautiful
Their builders
crenellations.
wanted to construct places of worship with upwards-looking spaces and light-filled interiors, features that spoke of the God they worshipped. To realize these grand goals, generations of builders from the 12th to 16th centuries were forced to make dramatic advances in both architecture and engineering. Their efforts gave rise to many
There's a good look at a growing vault.
including
2
large
arches
buildings
coming
with
together at a
complex
90-degree
vaulted
angle,
ceilings,
and then there's a
high
cross
stained
between
glass
each bay.
windows, pointed arches that reduce
There's a good
lateral
look at the
loading,
3-part with
and
the
fine
triforium.
buttresses that can support tall, thin walls while letting the sun shine in.
And note how much
For
light can now
thousands
come
of
in.
years leading up to this time, most buildings were constructed using posts and beams.
Remember, that's
The
Stonehenge.
vertical loads
That's all
carried
of the
by
Greek and
beams
Roman
resulted
architecture up
in
until the
simple
dome.
vertical loads in the posts or walls to which they were attached. Beams, however, could not stretch across the much wider spaces required for the new cathedrals. Arches, like this model, or this simplified model, could span these large distances. However, they generated large horizontal forces at their ends, and they could collapse if those forces were not adequately resisted. Short, thick walls might be able to resist these forces, but
Called
the
buttresses.
cathedral designers wanted tall, thin ones. And they wanted to put large glass windows in those walls so the sun could illuminate the inside of their cathedrals. The horizontal loads generated by arch ceilings would have easily pushed over the kinds of walls they wanted to build. One possible solution to this problem was to pile stone on the outside of the building so as to support the wall. Over time, the engineers developed structures called buttresses, and these elegant structures could be found in many early Gothic cathedrals. Unfortunately, they tend to block the sunlight, as this model demonstrates. In time, designers figured out how to build thin lateral supports called flying buttresses. The earlier buttress designs were essentially broken into separate tall pieces and moved a short distance from the side of the building. The resulting tall sections were called piers, and they were connected to each other and to the side of the cathedral using sloped arch-like members called flyers. As this model demonstrates, flying buttresses kept the tall, thin walls from collapsing, and they allowed the sun to shine in. This drawing shows how the forces from the vaulted ceilings were transferred to the flyers and then down through the piers to the ground. Spires and other heavy architectural features were sometimes placed on the tops of the
And that's
piers
also where they put the
so that
gargoyles.
the lateral components of the arch forces could be more efficiently transferred to the ground.
So the gargoyles had a
By
technical
spires,
function.
we mean the high pointed tips of the piers. As you can see, the resulting buttress systems can be quite complicated. Since the designers did not have computers to help them, they relied on scale models, the much more sophisticated ones than ours. Those models helped them to fine-tune their designs, and they showed them the right order in which to build the various parts of the cathedral so that it would remain stable during construction. In what order should the components of this cathedral be built? Let's try building the shell of the building first. Oh, that turns out to be a poor choice. It's a good thing that this is just a model. Let's try again. This time, let's work towards the center and start with the most distant flyer. Then add the inner flyer, and finally add the arch. If we take our hands away, the cathedral model stands. The model has taught us that this is a much better construction plan.
And also it means that the
Once
inside of the
stonework in
church, this is
cathedral
the
was
nave
finally
right in the
completed,
middle, that
it
was not
typically
able to
covered
be
with a
used for
slate
30 or
shingled wooden
40
roof
years.
to keep off the rain.
So you would have to keep
We
another
hope this
church in
video
check
helps you to
while you're building.
understand why Gothic cathedrals are such a triumph of architecture and engineering. Besides their beauty, many Gothic cathedrals have remained in service for more than 700 years, and they continue to inspire those who visit them. We hope you will consider watching some of our other engineering models videos.
And so as you can see, and as explained, those flying buttresses actually with separating out the buttressing off to the sides are what allow all that stained glass to come in, which is just a remarkable feature, because I'll show you how it transforms the environment inside. Now, before we get there, we also have to finish talking about the spires and the decoration on the outside. Remember, the inside is heaven, which means the outside of earth is a representation of hell and all the damnation and all the sins and all the punishments. So when you come inside, clean yourself, we want you in the heavenly world. Out here is where all that temptation and damnation. That's where the gargoyles come in. The gargoyles were there meant to scare. They were the dominant features. Now they have two features. One is to scare, and really to think about, all right, here's the demon monsters that may worship you in hell or may be attacking you in hell when you're there. But they also are weights that often are used on the top of spires that can actually look out, that help weigh down the spires, so when the flying buttresses are pushing out, that extra weight locks it in place. And so sometimes they're on the top as well. Here you see a whole bunch of different types of gargoyles. And the most famous ones, of course, from Notre Dame Cathedral, particularly because of Disney's Notre Dame, who actually made these into lovable characters rather than fearing the world and watching over, basically warning you, hey, get in church, otherwise we're going to come and torment you at night. Today we see Disney's Haunted Mansion, Fortnite gargoyles, Hunchback of Notre Dame. Gargoyles are still part of our popular culture. We've generally made them, yes, in demonic, kind of terrifying creatures, but we've also softened them and make them much easier. Who doesn't love the three gargoyles from the Hunchback of Notre Dame? Now, there's been some weird features. Note the gargoyle. That is a real gargoyle right here. Note, it basically, Alien the model borrowed it. Look how technological this actually appears, with armor and plate and kind of ribs that would show up much later on, really hundreds of years beforehand. And so this is that monster basically, and this is the original idea from the cathedral, from a real Gothic cathedral. Now, as part of your homework, I had you watch Cathedral by David Macaulay, but only the animated features. So I think the animated features do a nice job to show you how the Gothic Cathedral goes up and also all the other parameters. So I just put it here, but I don't need you to watch it. Here, we'll talk about that later. Now, the difference that shows up is that we're going to get a separation here between heaven versus hell in medieval thought. And the person that's going to be responsible for the outpouring of this creative, hellish, demon, gargoyle type culture is really going to be Dante. And so here's Dante's impact in terms of how we think about hell from the earlier world. It's called Dante's Inferno.
Abandon all hope, ye who enter here. Inscribed above the gate of hell, these ominous words warn dark tidings for Dante as he begins his descent into Inferno. Yet despite the grim tone, this prophecy sets into motion what is perhaps the greatest love story ever told, an epic journey that encompasses both the human and the divine. But for Dante to reach benevolent salvation, he must first find his way through hell. This landscape of torture is the setting for Inferno.
And note, this is nowhere listed in the Bible, as we'll talk about afterwards.
By Dante
it's an
Alighieri
invention of his mind and of
casting
thought of the
himself
time
as the
period.
protagonist. Dante travels deeper and deeper into hell's abyss, witnessing obscene punishments distinct to each of its 9 realms. Beginning in limbo, he travels through the circles of lust, gluttony, greed, wrath, heresy, violence, and fraud, to the horrific 9th circle of treachery, where sinners are trapped under the watchful eyes of Satan himself. The following 2 parts, Purgatorio and Paradiso, continue Dante's journey as he scales the Mount of Purgatory and ascends the 9 celestial spheres of heaven. Written together over 10 years, these 3 sections comprise the Divine Comedy, an allegorical imagining of the soul's journey towards God. But Dante's Divine Comedy is more than just religious allegory.
The 3 breakup
It's
again
also
for
a
the Trinity.
scathing commentary on Italian politics. A soldier and statesman from Florence, Dante was staunchly faithful to God, but often critical of the Roman Catholic Church. He particularly disliked its rampant nepotism and practice of simony, the buying and selling of religious favors such as pardons from sin. Many groups took advantage of these corrupt customs, but few supported them as much as the Guelfi Neri, or Black Guelphs. This was a political and religious faction which sought to expand the Pope's political influence. Dante was a member of the Guelfi Bianchi, or White Guelphs, who believed Florence needed more freedom from Roman influence. As a public representative for the White Guelphs, Dante frequently spoke out against the Pope's power, until the Black Guelphs leveraged their position to exile him from Florence in 1302. But rather than silencing him, this lifelong exile led to Dante's greatest critique of all. Dishonored and with little hope of return, the author freely aired his grievances with the Church and Italian society. Writing the Divine Comedy in Italian, rather than the traditional Latin of the educated elite, Dante ensured the widest possible audience for his biting political commentary. In the Inferno's circle of the wrathful, Dante eagerly witnesses sinners tear Black Guelph Filippo Argenti limb from limb. In the circle of fraud, Dante converses with a mysterious sinner burning in the circle's hottest flames. He learns that this is Pope Nicholas III, who tells Dante that his 2 successors will take his place when they die, all 3 guilty of simony and corruption. Despite the bleak and sometimes violent imagery in Inferno, the Divine Comedy is also a love story. Though Dante had an arranged marriage with the daughter of a powerful Florentine family, he had also been unrequitedly in love with another woman since he was 9 years old, Beatrice Portinari. Despite allegedly meeting just twice, she became Dante's lifelong muse, serving as the inspiration and subject for many of his works. In fact, it's Beatrice who launches his intrepid journey into the pits of hell and up the terraces of Mount Purgatory. Portrayed as a powerful heavenly figure, she leads Dante through Paradiso's concentric spheres of heaven until he is finally face to face with God. In the centuries since its publication, the Divine Comedy's themes of love, sin, and redemption have been embraced by numerous artists, from Auguste Rodin and Salvador Dali to Ezra Pound and Neil Gaiman. And the poet himself received his own belated earthly redemption in 2008, when the city of Florence finally revoked Dante's antiquated exile. Next, find out why you should read the Tolstoy classic, War and Peace.
So Dante's Inferno basically lays out 9 different levels of hell. Limbo for those individuals who really haven't committed any sin or were born before the Christian God. And so we see, so there's really no suffering in limbo. It's that area for just people that were born in the wrong time period. Your Hercules, your Augusta Suprema Porta, going all the way down to 9, the treacherous that Satan is watching over. So you can see how they've organized their 7 deadly sins. Lust, not that important of a deadly sin. Gluttony, a little bit worse. Greed, anger, heresy is the first really deadly sin that's in the lower level of hell. And that is literally, heresy is turning away from the church. Then they have violence, fraud, and treachery. Especially for those people who don't just not believe in God, atheists, but encourage others not to believe in God as well. And so if we look through the historical ramifications of what Dante would have had as the biblical inspiration for the Inferno and for hell, note the biblical description of hell, it talks about it being a real place, but that it's everlasting. You have weeping and gnashing of teeth. Worm dieth not even worms die. It's got an outer darkness and a worse fate than under the law of Moses. But note, it doesn't talk about individuals being punished for individual sins. It doesn't talk about certain sins being worse than others. It doesn't put homosexuals in the worst realms of hell, which Dante does, and later on Michelangelo is going to correct in his artwork in the Sistine Chapel. It does not actually look through and talk about fire and burning and these awful things. It really talks about a world that is terrible because you are not intervened, you are not reunited with Jesus and with God. So, but that is really the worst thing for a Christian perspective. But no, it's not talking about for some being that is overly welcoming and overly generous and overly forgiving. No, the Bible does a pretty good job with dealing with it. Our interpretation, human interpretation of that, and Dante's interpretation has been far worse. So it's the modern day making of horror films. As such, Pope Gregory and Dante are going to have to organize the 7 deadly sins, because you're going to have to come with, if there's levels of hell, where do those 7 deadly sins go? And the one deadly sin, or one of the sins today that really was a very terrible sin, was the idea of sloth. Sitting around and wasting your God-given talents and doing nothing. That was considered one of the worst sins, because you were basically wasting your time here on earth, which was limited, and that God had given you. Please don't judge me when you find out, if you don't know this artwork. This is Garden of Earthly Delights by Hieronymus Bosch. He's a Renaissance artist with a medieval perspective about the fearing of God and of the sins. And so don't judge me when you find out this artwork is about, as this is one of my 3 favorite artworks of all time. And so if you look around, you can see all sorts of lust. That's the easy one to find. But this particular artwork deals with what are the ramifications for committed the 7 deadly sins, because the next image in the panel is the terrible depiction of hell based upon Dante's Inferno. And so, of course, our 7 deadly sins, over time, they are lust, gluttony, pride, envy, greed, wrath, and sloth. And where they are in terms of the importance on one another has changed throughout time. During the same time period, then, as long as we're looking at religious figures like Pope Gregory, here's a piece of music by Hildegard de Bingen, or Hildegard of Bingen. She lived from 1098 to 1179. She's the first composer's biography that we ever have. She wrote the first Christian morality play ever. Her music was created to bring man back to paradise, to bring us to a holier time period, like in the Garden of Eden. And she supervised and illuminated manuscript an entire workshop. So she is a remarkable nun from this time period. She was given the opportunity of having mystical visions as a child, and that set her on the pathway of being a nun and creating these beautiful pieces of music to get us closer to heavens. And there's a short video I'd like to show you about the remarkable life of Hildegard of Bingen. I'm going to stop the share here, so otherwise the music will continue on, and we will go back to our screen.
In this presentation, we will discuss the life and works of Saint Hildegard of Bingen. Saint Hildegard was born in 1098 in Bockelheim, West Franconia, Germany. She had her first vision when she was 3 years old about a cow. She kept her talents a secret. Her parents found out and dedicated her to the church, St. Disipod Abbey of Bisvadenberg. It was there that she met Jetta of Scanheim, who became her friend. Hildegard was taught at the abbey how to write, read, and chant the Opus Dei. She spent most of her time perfecting her weaving. Jetta is the first person that Hildegard told about her vision. Jetta told these visions to Volmar, a St. Disipod monk, and Volmar was the first person to validate Hildegard's vision. She needed Volmar as a voice of reason because she had a lot of self-doubt due to her lack of formal education. She needed confirmation from the church, and Volmar gave her that. Jetta died in 1136, and Hildegard became her successor. She left the Benedictine monastery, and 5 years later she was called to write down her visions. Her first work was entitled Symbolism. She had 26 visions in total. It was structured in 3 parts: the chronicle of the order of God's creation, describes the order of redemption, recapitulates the history of salvation. Her major works are the Liber Vitae Miratorum and the Liber Divinorum Opera. In the Liber Vitae Miratorum, Book of Life's Merits, she talks about a vision she had of a giant man reaching from the ocean to the sky. She interprets this as frustration with the divide between the church and the emperor. Her next work was the Liber Divinorum Opera, Book of Divine Works. It was written in 1163 to 1174. This work was a narrative of God's love for the world he created. Hildegard's greatest love was music. She believed that music is the highest form of human activity, mirroring the sounds of the angels and the inner life of the soul. She said that through music, we were taken beyond our earthly instruments back to the divine melody Adam knew before. We need to remember that singing is our best way to hear the divine level again. Her music is described as monophonic, and it consisted of one melodic line. It is different.
And that's traditional of Gregorian chants that you're hearing here, monophony.
Entitled Ordo Virtues, Play of Virtues, is a play about morality. It consists of melodies for the 16 virtues and the anima, the human soul. One of St. Hildegard's greatest legacies was her title as the Doctor of the Church. She believed in integrating natural medicine with spirituality. Hers are the only survival medical treatises for the 12th century. She said that all science is a gift from God and that her greatest treasure is her regal intellect. People flocked to ask her questions and obtain treatments for their ailments. She published a large treatise about how to cure illnesses with plants, herbs, and precious stones. Furthermore, she corresponded widely with the highest echelons of medieval society. She was asked for advice for knowledge of the state of people's souls and explanations of divine mysteries. She held nothing back when lacerating corrupt clergymen and prelates for their abuses of the church. St. Hildegard was given the title of the Doctor of the Church in May of 2012 when Pope Benedict formally declared her a saint.
And one of her major accomplishments, besides combining religion and science during the time period, which was very rare, is also her accomplishments in the musical arts, which we still play her Gregorian monophonic chants today as a way of kind of transcending and becoming closer with God. Now let me get to that. Okay. And I will get back there in just a moment. We want to share our screen, but this time I would like to talk a little bit louder over the music. There we go. So I have to move myself out of the way. There we go. All right. So one of the most important parts, as we've talked about and been wading up to, is getting the creation of stained glass windows. Where here's the technique. There's a drawing design, and so then the sheets of glass are cut out along those designs. So first they're going to be scored, then they're going to be chipped with the cutting design. They're going to fall in randomly shaped pieces, some randomly shaped pieces, which then are soldered together, and the entire piece is actually installed. Note how thin it is. There's no way that that window is going to be able to support an entire Gothic cathedral. And that's why we need the flying buttresses. So they really serve as basically giant holes in windows, so there's no pressure. Otherwise, the stained glass would get destroyed. Just like we saw with the historiated capitals, there's going to be a whole series of stained glass windows that are going to show up. And this one, most famous one, is from Chartres that we'll look at in a little while. But this is the whole notion of kind of stained glass. And you can see it's much better to tell the stories here. On the left is the tree of Jesse, basically showing that Christ comes out of the Christian figure, coming out of the belly or the stomach of the tree of Jesse. And here's the blue Virgin, blue being one of the most expensive colors to make in stained glass. We have nativity scenes, we have Noah scenes. This is actually the stained glass wall of Noah, where it's actually going through the entire story of Noah from the Bible. That's in Chartres. We see the entire movement of Jesus. We see the Last Supper, followed by the crucifixion, followed by the resurrection, followed by the deposition, taking down from the cross. And so those are just 4 of the more than 180 windows that are all large scale at Chartres Cathedral. And you see the beautiful quality of the light. The red, much of the red was actually made out of ground up rubies. And that's why it's called ruby red. Later on, Wizard of Oz is going to have ruby red slippers. They were $1,000 per square foot way back in the medieval world about 1,000 years ago. So you imagine a square foot, something along about the size of, what about this? And by that, that's 1,000 feet per square foot. So here is a time-elapsed video of the way, if you walk around a Gothic cathedral, that the stained glass follows you around, transforms that ugly light from the outside world, that white, dirty light, into this beautiful experience. So here's the sunrise. See how it moves while you're there. Here's the sun rising, going higher in the sky during the day. Now, none of this is enhanced. This is a time-elapsed video to show you how it changes over time. This is the actual colors that stained glass really looks like. It's a gorgeous art form. And I am going to stop there for the first part of our Gothic lecture. We will come back and continue on Gothic art and look really at the Renaissance and then the English Gothic that really doesn't want to be associated with French Gothic and their changes, specifically because they are enemies and so they don't want anything called Gothic. They need to come up with their own new style and claim that it's theirs. We'll do that in the next lecture. Have a wonderful day, and I hope everything goes well. Bye.